Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Sword and Trowel. Today, Graham and I get to have a wonderful conversation with Dr. Carrie Gress, who is the author of this new book, The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. It is a phenomenal book in that it is accessible, it's easily read and easily distributed, easy to talk about, and we encourage everyone to get a copy of it because she shows how the ideology of feminism has wrecked Western civilization, including churches. So we encourage you to listen into this and spread it around. We especially want to thank our Founders Alliance members. Because of their support, we're able to provide this type of content to you. Welcome to the Sword and Trowel podcast. The Sword and Trowel is a podcast of Founders Ministries, and Founders exists for the recovery of the gospel and the reformation of local churches. And I'm Tom Ascol.
And I'm Graham Gunden.
We're delighted to have you join us today for what we are convinced is a very important conversation about a wonderful and important book that's been written by Dr. Carrie Gress. So, Dr. Gress, thank you for joining us all the way from your home in Virginia.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I read this book, I think, sometime in the last few months, and I forget who it was that put it on to me. Someone was talking about hearing you speak and then reading your book and said, man, you've got to read this. And so once I did, I became convinced this is great. This is something that needs a wider audience in our particular circles. Dr. Gress, you are a wife and a mother. You have 5 children, is that correct?
5 kids. Yep.
Okay. What's the upper age of those children?
I have a 15-year-old down to a 4-year-old.
Okay.
So a lot of different directions these days.
Must be a joyful house.
It is that most of the time.
Yeah. Certainly an active
certainly
house.
Have our moment, but yeah.
Graham's got 3 kids.
That's right.
Oldest is 5.
Youngest is 1.5. Yeah.
That's right. I've got 6, and they're all gone and enjoying the life of grandparenting now. So we've got 18 with 3 on the way, and that's a wonderful time of life as well. You also are an author. You've written several books. Again, this most recent book, The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us, which is a very provocative title, and it fits the content of the book quite well. You're a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in D.C. as well, and then you edit I don't know what it is, an online website or magazine or something, Theology of Home or At Home?
Theology of Home, yeah. It's an online women's magazine that I started about 5 years ago, largely to just really meet the needs of Christian women. It feels like so much content that we like to absorb is very leftist. And so it's, I think it's time for us to start getting back into beautiful, rich content for women that's really compelling and fun, but that has somewhat much more Christian message. So that's what Theology of Home is.
Wonderful. So I think if someone were to see your resume on paper and not know you, and you left off being a wife and mother, they would say, man, here is a poster child for exactly what we've been arguing for women. You've got a PhD, you're involved in various aspects of public life. So tell us about yourself, if you don't mind. I mean, you're from Oregon, correct?
Yeah, I grew up in Oregon, a very lukewarm Catholic family, and just really bought into, what the world was teaching us. I remember like 2nd grade feeling like I needed to be in competition with the boys in the 2nd grade. This was just sort of hammered into women from that stage on. And then when I was in high school, my father actually passed away. And it was really that experience that I think led me to ask a lot of really deep questions. When you're 15 years old and watching someone, succumb to pancreatic cancer, I think it's got to change you a lot. So anyway, I started on a very intense spiritual journey. And that was really where I started looking at things, taking my faith more seriously and just becoming a much more faithful Christian than I had been up until then. But I started asking, the bigger questions, certainly about women, largely because as I got older, I realized, and at this point I was still very much following the women's movement, sort of all of the cues. You have to get this advanced degree and have a great career and, really focus on those things, and marriage and family will sort of sort itself out later on. And I had this experience of dating a number of men who then went on to marry kindergarten teachers. And, it was really striking for me because I just thought, well, I'm sure I'm living in Washington. I'm working on K Street. I'm getting a doctorate in philosophy. Like, what do these kindergarten teachers have? And so anyway, it was really striking to me to start realizing, that there's a lot more to being a woman than just all the things that I had been told. And, I started paying attention to things like music, lyrics, and poetry, and what it is that men say about women when they don't know that women are really listening, because so much of it feels very scripted when you just talk to people, but when they really can let down, then you realize that there's something obviously very important about a woman who is present to a man, that she can be focused on him and he can kind of rest in her. There's a sense where she can build him back up. And these are the things that I had just never really heard. I saw it in my parents' relationship, but it wasn't something that I had ever connected the dots on. And so that was really transforming to me, to sort of realize there's just this whole world of femininity that I don't understand, and I want to understand it, and I want to dig into this. I want this in my life. I don't want the kind of marriage where it feels like I'm dominating my husband and he's just a yes man, but I wanted a rich relationship where I was a real wife and not just a mother. So gratefully, a lot of transformation and pain led me to, totally different direction. But I think this is, a lot of women's journey, and a lot of us are very confused. As we know, that it's very hard for us to even define what a woman is at this stage because of all of this confusion, because we've tried to erase this idea of motherhood, whether it's spiritual, biological, or even psychological. So anyway, that's really what I've started tackling in a lot of my books and articles that I write.
So were you going through this transformation, thinking through femininity and all? You were single at this time, is that correct?
So I was single at this time. And the other thing that was really interesting was that when I was in graduate school, I actually said, I think out loud to God, I will never work on women's issues.
And thus your fate was sealed.
It really was. But I think what I was reacting to was just the sense of how academic our discussions were, certainly among the academics that I knew about womanhood, and how incapable I was of being able to pass these kinds of articles or books on to women I knew, whether it was my sisters or my friends. There was just no way that you were going to make this very intense philosophical jargon something that was compelling to the average woman. And so this, I think, is one of the things that I have spent a lot of time doing, is how do we make our discussions about these things accessible to any kind of woman. And so I have a doctorate in philosophy, and you can see some of that in the book, but the books that I've written are meant to be read. They're meant to be, quickly read and not bog people down in the minutia of the arguments about, philosophical things that they don't really care about. It's really to hammer home the points of what has happened to women and why women are so intensely unhappy in our culture. So that's been, I think, the angle that I've taken is we need to make this, something that people can absorb and enjoy and really get something out of in a quick and compelling way. That's, in some places, like my work with Theology of Home actually is fun. And in other places, it's just really moving because it's a lot of truth talking in very plain language.
Yeah, I felt that as I read the end of Woman. I couldn't put it down. And it's very easy, accessible read. It's fewer than 200 pages. But in many ways, I felt like each chapter could have been a book. I mean, just scratching the surface of these issues. And so, which I think is good, kind of whets the appetite to dig deeper, if you have the stomach for some of it and some of these characters that you bring out in the end of Woman. So I commend you for that. A very enjoyable read for myself and for my wife.
Yeah, which makes it completely unlike all other feminist literature that I've ever dabbled in.
Yeah, you don't hear many people, husbands and wives, reading Betty Friedan together. So, a great triumph.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Sword and the Trowel. I wanted to let you know that we have a special offer for those of you who order from press.founders.org in the month of July. Any order will come accompanied by this wonderful vintage Founders Journal, physical copy. Tom Ascol has an article in here, a lesson from Spurgeon on evangelism. And there's also a wonderful article by Roger Nicole, Polemic Theology, How to Deal with Those Who Differ from Us. So if you make any order in the month of July, go to press.founders.org. You will get one of these vintage copies of the Founders Journal.
So tell us why you wrote the book. I mean, what was the genesis of it?
So I initially had written a book largely for a Catholic audience called The Anti-Mary Exposed this came out in 2018. And the subtitle of that was Rescuing the Culture from Toxic Femininity. And I really looked at the second wave feminism and just focused on, the women that are running the culture today are not just a little bit off from Christianity, but they're diametrically opposed to Christianity. And, I went into elements of the occult, Madonna's halftime show that she said was performance, things like that, very popular things. But I also went into some of the philosophy of it. And this book, did incredibly well. It actually got canceled 4 days after the inauguration of Joe Biden. The Meta took it off of, you couldn't sell it on any of their marketplaces. And I'm sure it was because of the subtitle, which, about toxic femininity. So it's really interesting to see the media that picked it up. I was actually on the front cover of Russia Times talking about this kind of censorship that was happening in the United States. So in any event, that book came out, and I had so many people say, can you write a book that I can give to my Protestant friends, or I can give to secular friends, atheists, that they would still be able to get this rich content and, these compelling ideas that they're not getting anywhere else. And so it was in the back of my mind always to write this. And, I thought, let me write this, but in the first book, I didn't at all look at the first wave of feminism. I had just was under the impression that the first wave was great, that it was very kind of a pure form of feminism that we could really look up to. But I thought, let me just go back and look and check and, make sure I really understand the first wave. And from there, that was really what became the backbone of the book, was focusing on the first wave and just how, what I saw there. I thought it would be 2 days of research, and it ended up being months and months of research on the first wave. But what I saw was that the initial ideas, the things that define feminism in the culture today, which are, I reduced them kind of down to 3 basic ideas. One of them is this idea of free love. I mean, that was the language they used back in the 1800s, the end of monogamy, really. Another one is the occult, which of course we see in spades around us, very rampant in celebrity culture. The third one is this idea of smashing the patriarchy, or this idea of egalitarianism, sort of collapsing the culture down into where nobody's above it. There's no hierarchy like in the church or in the military. Apparently there's an exception for corporations, but in any event, don't seem to be bothered by that.
Got to make that money.
And football teams.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. But so anyway, all of those 3 things I saw very, very early on, actually in the early 1800s. They're articulated by a man, Percy Shelley, who's not typically associated with the feminist movement. But he brought all of those elements together based on his in-laws, who were Mary Wollstonecraft, who's considered kind of the grandmother of feminism, and then her husband, who's William Godwin, whose ideas went on to highly influence Marx. He was very much opposed to monogamy. He thought it was a kind of slavery. He actually had been a Protestant pastor and had left because he realized he didn't believe in Christianity anymore. And so anyway, so those 2 parents of his wife, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, influenced Percy Shelley significantly. And then he brought his own occult interest into the mix. And that's really what, that blueprint is what we are dealing with today. And the real motivation, I think, too, was this idea of trying to help women. I think this is the message we hear all the time. People think feminism is just a way to help women. But the way in which they wanted to help women was by making women more like men instead of with being women and their feminine attributes, certainly their fertility. So that's really what's really moved it forward, was kind of this bait and switch of, we're helping women, but we're doing it in a way that's actually not in accord with their human nature at all. We're doing it in a way that thwarts that through things like free love and the occult and on and on.
That was one of the things that was so eye-opening to me. I'm glad to hear you say it the way you did. You make reference to it in the book, that first wave feminism, I've always just given a pass to it. Because I thought, well, women get the vote, okay, they ought to be treated well, and men shouldn't be beating up women. But to see the clear occult foundations of this, your book has convinced me that what we see, and I think most people of goodwill protest today in what is happening to women in the LGBTQ stuff that has just tried to erase distinctions between men and women, that is all the natural fruit of what goes back to that root. And would you say that? Would that be a fair statement?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think this is, from the very beginning, the idea was to get rid of the differences between men and women. And actually, Percy Shelley mentions that. He says, wouldn't it be great if someday we can get rid of gender distinctions entirely? This is, again, like 1810 that he's saying this. So it's very, very early. And we see it over and over again in the feminist movement in different stages. But it was very much a stated goal by the second wave feminists. But they didn't make it up. It came from the early first wavers.
Yeah, I think even in the first chapter in talking about Mary Wollstonecraft, in the way that she wanted to define what a woman is that a woman is simply a human being.
Human, yeah.
And then when you define woman that way, I mean, that's planting the seeds for what we see. And then eventually you get to Simone de Beauvoir and her ideology and how that really kind of hatched the egg that became transgenderism.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Because what happens is when you try to make someone a human, what you do is create a superior category above male and female. So suddenly male and female can be detached from a person, and you just have a person as sort of this blank canvas that can then take on whatever attributes or desires they want. So that was really the start of it. So you can see that again. I mean, this was a fascinating thing for me to go through all of this research and see just these waves where you see, someone has the idea and then it kind of goes underground for a couple of generations and then it comes back up, usually in the 1960s. Sometimes in the 1930s, just the patterns keep coming over and over again. But yeah, there was a popular bumper sticker when I was growing up that feminism is that radical idea that women are human beings, I think. It plays into that idea of we're this blank canvas and we can be women or not. We can sort of step out of our womanhood and kind of become whatever we want. And as you mentioned, Simone de Beauvoir, takes the idea of Nietzsche, this idea of self-creation, and suddenly you've got the whole trans movement that's built exactly on all of this.
One of the things we've been trying to emphasize here on the Sword and Trowel, our own ministries here at church, at Grace Baptist Church, is that ontology can no longer be assumed. We have to go back and just acknowledge what reality is, because so much of what we're being force-fed today is a denial of reality, and something as simple as what a man is, what a woman is, and to flatten that out and say, well, no, humanity is what we are, and the measure of a woman is a man, the measure of a man is a woman. There's no way you're going to go right on that if you start from those wrong kinds of ontological presuppositions.
Yeah, it seems like especially Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, we've advanced in a lot of ways in the West, but one of our biggest failures is metaphysics. I mean, we just do not understand. We fail to think in proper categories these days. And that's what leads to these failures in understanding what a woman is, understanding what a human being is even.
Yeah, I appreciate your language of toxic femininity on that, which is such a wonderful way to put that. And I've started describing myself as a recovering feminist, and I feel like I probably will be to the day I die.
Have you ever described yourself as a feminist?
No, never did that, but I was always sympathetic to first wave, and anytime I would preach on feminism or teach on it or write on it, I'd always give a caveat, that, okay, men were treating women badly and that's why these things happened. They were trying to, not die. And I was ignorant. Just completely ignorant of it. And this book has been so helpful in giving me expressions to grab hold of to describe my ignorance.
Yeah, and I think one thing that you do well in the book is, you point out what feminism is responding to. I mean, it's not coming out of a vacuum. It's not like there weren't problems. It's not like there weren't women who were being abused.
There were bad men.
Yes, absolutely. And there continue to be bad men.
Yeah.
And there will always be bad men. But feminism's not the answer to that.
Right.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Sword and the Trowel today. If this episode has been helpful to you, or if any of the resources that Founders Ministries puts out is helpful, and there are many resources if you go to founders.org, we'd love for you to come alongside us, to support us in our ministry and in our endeavors. The Lord's been kind to us and faithful to us in allowing us to do so many things, from our publishing to our podcasts to our theological journals and conferences and many other things. But if the Lord is calling you to come alongside us and support us in this, we'd ask you to go to founders.org, and you can go to the Give tab there and support us financially. We thank the Lord for your gift.
Yeah, because what it's trying to do is erase womanhood so that women then become invulnerable to the bad men. It's sort of trying to get them to step out of the relationships and the vulnerability that's actually required for a family to exist. There's nothing more vulnerable than a woman who's just had a baby and that newborn baby. And that's really why we need the masculine to be ordered and beautiful and, in complementarity with the woman. And this is what feminism has done, is it says, I'm not going to make myself vulnerable because I could be hurt. And, as you mentioned, sadly, so many women have been hurt by it. The response isn't to sort of step out of the game altogether because you might be hurt. It's a question of how do we raise people? How do we get back to human nature and order it in such a way so that our society can flourish with healthy men and women instead of all these distortions that we feel like we have to sort of navigate through, which is what Marxism and the left has done in the last century certainly is try to recalibrate human nature such that we can change it into really anything that we want. And of course, now we're seeing just the incredible fracturing and brokenness that is happening because we destroyed the family and all of these elements and which people need to have to grow and to be healthy human beings.
One of the things you did in your book is you showed the connection between feminism as a movement and Marxism or neo-Marxism in the Frankfurt School, and how these things just played into the very same ideology of tearing down all hierarchies, flattening out the world. Would you elaborate on that a little bit, or just talk about some of the things that you saw there?
Sure. So the socialist influence really started, I was able to pinpoint it back to about the 1890s. There was actually a magazine called Lucifer magazine, of course. And it was a socialist magazine that was really started promoting this idea called the gospel of discontent. And this was trying to stir up women to believe that they were incredibly unhappy and miserable, and they wanted to exacerbate that and have women leave the family, leave their homes, create this life of independence away from husbands and children for their own purposes, their own socialist efforts. And so this went along for a while. And then actually the Marxists in the early 1900s, initially the Marxists and the feminists didn't like one another. The Marxists thought that the feminists were too bourgeois, and the feminists thought the Marxists were just too political and angry and aggressive, and they didn't mesh together at all until there was a Russian woman who actually, she's the founderess of the International Day of Women. She realized, we've got all these academic women who are angry and bitter, and we can capitalize on that gospel of discontent. There's that idea again, and we can use them because women are very emotionally malleable. They can become sort of the second tier of what this army that we're trying to create for the revolution that they were trying to achieve. And so at that point, that's when the feminists and the Marxists really started working together. And there was a woman named Bella Dodd who had been very deeply involved in the Communist Party. She was involved in trying to get Marxism into education. And she was very successful at it. And then she went to form this group called the Congress for American Women. And this was absolutely a communist organization, very much Soviet propaganda. They were really held up, the Soviets, that where you could get an abortion on demand. You couldn't own a stitch of property, but you could get an abortion at the drop of a hat. You could get a divorce through a postcard, but women were focused on as these ideal workers. Their children were taken from them and they just went to work immediately. So this was really the model that was held up. And this group eventually was disbanded by Congress because it was so anti-American. But the women that were there were all incredibly influential, including, the wife of a senator. You had the wife of Gumbel's department store was there. And you also had Betty Friedan, who, of course, went on to write The Feminine Mystique. And Betty Friedan's work is really amazing when you read The Feminine Mystique, because you see these sort of footprints of Marxism in it, where she's so focused on getting women out of the home, not because she really wants their betterment, but because she wants women to be doing productive work like they're doing in the Soviet Union. She wants them, she even calls the home the comfortable concentration camp, because she's trying to get women to think that their homes are awful, raising children is awful, and you need to be out working. And, I think it's not too hard to look back at the culture over the last 50 years and realize just how incredibly successful she has been inculcating that idea of Marxist work into our lives, because so many women think that work is much superior to any kind of familiar life. The word homemaker is still incredibly taboo, even though all the elements of home are back. Things like knitting and sourdough baking and gardening. But don't call women a homemaker. It still feels like a very dangerous noun. So anyway, it's incredible how successful the Marxists have been in turn. And that's not even getting into the women of the second wave, like Kate Millett, who was very much involved in the New Left and really promoting the New Left ideas to women, this idea of women being a victim. Again, that gospel of discontent that women just have lapped up because it stirs up all these emotions in them that they feel, that they see empower them in the culture more broadly.
Maybe you could talk about that for a little bit as well, because that's one of the things that I found striking is almost the stated purpose of feminism is to make women miserable. I mean, like, that's not the end goal, but like that's what feminism is attempting to do in order to bring in this new utopia in which there's no distinctions between men and women, all of that. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to put it. That's the means through which they're trying to get power and control. It really is about power and control. It's not about femininity. It's not about service. It's not about love. It's not even about making women happy. It really is about trying to use the emotions of women to make them feel like they're either missing out or that they're somehow been victimized. And that's the way in which, that's what we respond to. So it takes very little. I know growing up, it takes very, very little to sort of, I guess we can use the language, sort of trigger a woman into sort of that defensive position of, you can't say that about women, or you can't say that about us, or you can't tell me to do that. It's just very, we've been very much groomed to act that way and to behave that way and to think that somehow something's going to be taken away from us, or we won't have the privileges, all of that I think has just been force fed to us over and over and over again, instead of something a little bit more rational, like maybe we should be separating ourselves from these emotional issues and start focusing on who it is that we are, looking at even our bodies inform us so well about what it is that we're meant to do. Carry life, shelter life, nourish life, provide opportunities for those that we love to become better human beings, to become the people that God intended them to be, rather than sort of this constant defensive mode where we feel like we have to sort of fight for ourselves with, a lot of energy and even rage and anxiety throughout the whole culture. And that's the beauty, obviously, of Christianity too, is that Christianity is the antidote to that, because when a woman knows that she's loved by the Father, suddenly she's a very different person. Suddenly these things don't have a grip on her the way that they do when she's, tethered into what the culture is telling us to do.
Well, and it's also interesting, I mean, the way that theme of misery and discontent, which runs through feminism, is also connected to the theme of, feminism is, and you describe it in the book, I don't know if you use these words, but it's a counter religion that redoes the creation myth, and Lucifer no longer is the bad guy, but Lucifer is the liberator. I mean, you mentioned the magazine Lucifer, and what does Lucifer do in the garden? He tells the woman, "Did God really say that? I mean, if you do this, you'll be like God." And that's the theme that runs throughout, and so that's why it's tied to the occult. That's why it's tied to this liberation myth with Satan. It is a counter religion, and I think the feminists have seen Christianity as really the greatest hurdle that they need to clear. And if they can create their own, creation myth, they can create their own religion, maybe they can clear that hurdle of Christianity.
Oh, that's such a great point, and that's exactly what they did. They knew they had to go all the way back to the beginning and reinterpret it. And this is, again, Percy Shelley's doing. He took actually the work of Milton and added his own twist to it, where, Eve becomes the heroine and serpent is giving her wisdom. And, but you also have to look at, too, just even that, what is it that Eve is being tempted by? It's this promise of something she doesn't already have. Did God say you couldn't do this, and that promise of a kind of knowledge that she doesn't have. So it's that thirsting after things that we don't have, and that's what feminism has really focused on. Is just even on the minutia arguments and the rights and the battles over salaries and all of these kinds of things that, we know actually at this point that a woman who never has children and has the same job or the same career path will probably make more money than a man does through the same career, just because of different variables. But obviously women make different choices and they have children and they choose different majors, and all of those kinds of things weigh into it. And yet this is what, they're constantly being hit on. The argument is always, it's not equal pay and all of this. It's always about something that women aren't getting. And that's really what the way in which, I think Eve is that great prototype of the unsatisfied woman. And that's exactly what the feminism has stirred up in us, is that dissatisfaction that we hope to somehow be satisfied. But again, it's rerouted in that, totally anti-Christian messaging that very few women realize is behind all of it.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation on the Sword and the Trowel. I wanted to make you aware and give you some more details on the regional conference that we are going to be having coming up here this July. That's July 26th and 27th, and it is the conference on family life in the negative world. Pastor Tom Ascol, Dr. Joel Beakey, and myself will all be there speaking for that conference. It's going to be a wonderful time. You can go to founders.org/familylife in order to register for that conference. It is just a shorter conference, a regional conference. It's just 2 days, but it's going to be a wonderful time of fellowship and thinking about what God has to say to us when it comes to how we are to live in families, be family members, and raise our families in an increasingly hostile world.
Last week, the Senate Armed Services Committee passed a version of the National Defense Reauthorization Act in which they said that women will also be drafted, that women should be a part of the Selective Service, which again goes diametrically opposite of the way God created the world. It's an attack on ontology. And part of our concern is that as Christians, certainly in our circles, evangelicals and more particularly Baptists, that we're not very well equipped to argue against that because we have given up so much ground to feminism. Comment on that. Talk about that prospect that seems to be in the air very realistically now.
Yeah, no, I know this isn't the first time that it's come up, and gratefully in the past it's never succeeded. So I pray that it won't this time, particularly as a mother with young daughters. But yeah, I think this is the real problem, and this is why the erasing of what it means to be a woman in our own minds is distinct from men, and distinct from the model of the male. I mean, this is what I was always given. This is what we're always fed: is that the male life is better than the female life, and that's the one to which we should be aspiring. And that's really the tragedy, because we haven't said anything good about motherhood really in 50 years. And this is what's amazing to me is as soon as you help a woman understand that even if she's not biologically a mother, she still has the maternal wiring, she still has obviously the body, she still has those gifts that God has given her, and that real relationality, that real, the attention to close details and being dialed into people, all of those kinds of things women have in spades. And so I think that those, when we start looking at that element of what women can offer, especially through this lens of the maternal, we become kind of a different person, and we come to know ourselves much better. And that gift of giving life, that's the real thing. But yeah, we should have actually expected this draft issue to come up, to have happened decades ago. Because of the fact of what has been pushed on us. But we have this real gift that, whether we're at home or we're in a workplace or we're in school or we are in the military, we're going to approach things differently because we have these unique and special gifts. That doesn't mean that there's not overlap between male and female in certain respects. But it means that this is something that once we start developing this, we become a much, much better person rather than trying to create ourselves and, make ourselves be something that we can never be. Obviously, even biologically, no matter what how much testosterone we pump into a woman's body, she's never going to become a man. So I think starting to have a conversation using the M word, the word of motherhood, I think it's really important, especially in very broad strokes, and helping people understand that it's not just, for women who have given birth. It's not like getting a driver's license, but it's a real orientation to the world that we have to offer in spades.
Yeah, and I find that sadly there are many women who are not wives or not mothers who recoil at that because they feel like you're saying that there's something less than, and it is not that. It's what God's wired into them, whether they get married or have biological children or not. And I find it fascinating. Last week was the annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention, which our church participates in, and one of the big debates we've been going through the last several years. We've been very clear since our inception that the role of pastors in Baptist churches is limited to men who are qualified by Scripture. And there have been some, they've been agitating minority voices, but they've gained some foothold, saying, no, women can do the same thing men can do. They can be pastors as well. And that debate has just continued on. I remember a few years ago at our annual meetings, there was a president who was a pastor of a North Carolina church, very prominent guy, and he had all these panels and had a bunch of women on all the panels and talking about how women can be just as effective as men in carrying out the mission of Jesus Christ, and talked about their various things that women had done, and not one time was the word mother mentioned. Like that's not even on the agenda when we're talking about women as being partners in the mission of Jesus Christ. And I thought, man, that is a snapshot of what's wrong. This same guy, when he was president, made this statement. I'd like for you to just kind of give me your comments on this. He said he looks forward to the day when we take all the Word of God seriously about tearing down all hierarchy.
Yeah. There it is. There it is. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the erasing of male and female. And, I think the bigger problem is, you've mentioned it already, this idea of ontology is the distinction between doing versus being. And that's the real thing. That's the real crux here is, yes, women can do these things, but they are made to be very different, and they're made to do things in a different way. And I think that's what we have to get back to in order to sort of start parsing out some of these issues, and again, get back to this idea of what is it that makes women different, and not just this idea of how can women be like men.
So with that, I mean, do you have, at the end of your book, you talk about the flyover women, the women you're describing that women ought to aspire to be, that are just overlooked. They're out there and they're quietly doing their jobs, and you never know that because they're not in the public eye. What do you have to say to those women? And then what counsel do you have for women?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is you're not alone. I think so many of us feel so alone. We feel like we're beaten down. We can't say anything. We feel like we're compared to the Handmaid's Tale, that we're sort of part of a fertility cult or something, or we're a doormat, and that's really what the left has done. They've been able to kind of form public opinion that this is the alternative to feminism. So I think we have to start fighting that, and really start presenting women as, incredibly beautiful and capable mothers, again, spiritually, psychologically, or biologically. And this is one of the things I've done with Theology of Home. We have a blog, but we also have a book series. And in the book series, we have what we call the forbidden pictures, and it's, where the men look like they're capable and they're good and they're healthy and, they're happy. You've got women who are pregnant. You've got large families where, people don't look bedraggled and beat up because they have children. So I think we need to get back into just the visuals of what it looks like to be a healthy, ordered woman, because we don't have the moral imagination right now to be able to start thinking about that. We don't have celebrities who live this out well. We don't have public figures that live this out well. In fact, if you try to name any, Christian woman by just her first name, like we do Hillary and, so many women that we can think of in just one term, there's not one that we could name that's on a popular level just by her first name. So I think that's one of the main goals that we have to be about in terms of reordering women. But I think the other aspect of it is just really to start understanding how incredibly beautiful it is when women live the life to which God has called them. And I think we have gotten away, we think of beauty either in very kind of raw sexual terms, or we think of it in vanity. But women were made to be beautiful for a reason. There's a reason why the women spend billions of dollars on cosmetics every year. There's a reason why this just feels like such an important thing in terms of our magazines and whatnot. Women are made to be beautiful. And, I think that one of the greatest examples of this, the beauty to which we should aspire, was someone like Mother Teresa, who was objectively not a beautiful woman. She did not spend any money on cosmetics or her hair or her clothing, but it was all just this interior beauty that came out of her that people just wanted to touch her, to be around her, to emulate her. And I think that's kind of the exciting thing, is that desire for beauty isn't for our sake, it's for the people around us, to bring us to Christ. And this is what a beautiful woman does for her husband. This is what she does for those around her, is to show them kind of the maternal aspect of what God has, and to lift people up to something higher and more ordered and more compelling. So I would obviously, heartily encourage any woman who feels like she's that flyover woman who's completely neglected by the culture, not even just neglected, but derided, that, you're on the right path and you're doing amazing things, and just let God work through you and bring that incredible fruit through your beauty, whatever way in which God wants to do that in your own family and for your husbands and children and wider community.
Final question for you. Is patriarchy good for women?
I love this question. So I wish I had done more on patriarchy in this book, because I had a bigger section in it, and it was relegated by my editor into a footnote. So patriarchy actually has been incredibly healthy for women. Obviously there are going to be bad actors, sure. and can recognize that. We can recognize that among, any male or female. But in terms of bringing order to women's lives, that has really been an incredible gift that I think that the patriarchy has to offer. And again, seeing it through the right lens, not the lens of which the left has painted it as this idea of toxic masculinity, but in terms of the gifts that men have, which, generally you get those 3 Ps: protection, patriarchy, and projection, progeny, and providing. Those are all really important things that men have been gifted to do. And, we see what has happened to men when they don't have the goal of providing for a wife or for children. We've got a lot of miserable, directionless men in the culture. Also, we also have a lot of women who can't find husbands. And I think that the two absolutely go together. And this is, part of the problem is that we've so disdained men, we've so silenced men through feminism that, we need to just start paying attention to their gifts and allowing men to have a voice on these issues, because that's the only way in which we're going to start really healing our culture and our church and the world.
Amen. And so we would say, particularly to men, which we try to say in our church, is brothers, you better step up, start getting up earlier, stay up later, get a handle on what's going on in the culture, how you have been steered, you've been played to misunderstand what God created you to be and what God created women to be. And until we start taking our proper place and doing what God's called us to do as men, we're not going to be in a position to help out our sisters and those that are dependent upon us, those who are very vulnerable in this particular cultural moment. Well, Carrie, thank you so much for your kindness and giving us your time today. Again, thank you for writing this book, The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. We want to encourage everyone, go out and get this book and read it. I think I said before we started recording that we're going to be doing a study of this book with whoever's interested at Grace Baptist Church sometime in the next few months, and encouraging folks to read it because we think it's that important to begin to think clearly about what has gone on and what is going on in our culture. So thank you so much for joining us on the Sword and Trowel today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we're glad that you tuned in to this episode of The Sword and Trowel. If you found it helpful, would you pass it around? And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to The Sword and Trowel on your favorite platform. It helps us then to beat that algorithm that is marshaled against us so that more people can tune in and participate with us in these conversations.